The fog on the Blackwood moors didn't just roll in, it seemed to breathe, a heavy damp lung pressing against the window panes of John's new home. The cottage was a skeletal thing of grey stone and rotting timber, standing alone where the cultivated fields gave way to gorse and peat. John had come here for the silence, hoping the isolation would finally allow him to finish his manuscript. He had found the doll in a clotted shop in the village, buried under moss-eaten lace. It was a Regency-era gentleman, perhaps 14 inches tall, with a face of cracked biscuit and eyes of fixed midnight blue glass. Its suit was of frayed emerald silk, and its expression was one of polite, frozen expectation. John had placed it on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a bit of character for his otherwise barren study. At first, change was subtle. On Tuesday, the doll's left hand, which had been tucked into its waistcoat, was resting on its knee. John paused, pen hovering over his legal pad, had reasoned that the vibrations from his heavy-footed pacing on the warped floorboards must have jarred it. He straightened the limb, feeling the cold, stiff resistance of the internal wireframe. By Friday, the silence of the moors began to feel heavy. The wind shrieked through the chimney, sounding like a distant choir out of tune. When John looked up from his desk, the doll was no longer facing the room. Its head was tilted 45 degrees, staring directly at him. Its porcelain chin was lowered, making the paint smirk look like a predatory baring of teeth. John didn't touch it this time. He sat very still, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Gravity," he whispered to the empty room. "The house is settling. The floor is slanted." The night he woke to a sound like a dry autumn leaves skittering across wood. Scritch, scritch, tap. He bolted upright, sweat sticking his neck. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and padded into the study. The doll was still on the mantel, but its legs, previously molded in a sitting position, were now dangling over the edge of the shelf. One tiny leather-shod foot was swinging back and forth in a slow, rhythmic arc. There was no wind in the room. The next morning, John drove into the village. With white knuckles, he found the local pub, the Eagle's Nest, and looked for the one man he hoped to avoid, Elias Storm. They had gone to school together years ago. Elias had been the boy who read Thoreau in the cafeteria and spoke of thin places where the veil between the worlds frayed. John, a man who believed in logic and the physical world, found Elias sitting in a corner booth, surrounded by old maps of the moor. "Elias," John said, his voice cracking, "I bought something at the antique shop, a doll, and I think it's following me." Elias looked up, his eyes dark and knowing. He didn't laugh. Instead, he pushed a chair out for John. "The shop on the corner with the black door. John, the people in this town don't buy things from that place. We just wait for them to find a way out." "Sit down, John," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low murmur that barely carried over the crackle of the pub's ads. "Tell me exactly how it moves." John explained the shifting limbs, the head that turned with precision of a predator, and the rhythmic tapping of the feet. As he spoke, he felt the absurdity of his words, yet the cold dread in his stomach was undeniable. Elias listened, his face hardening like flint. That shop is owned by a man who doesn't show his face in the light, Elias whispered. The things he sells aren't just antiques, they're vessels. On the moor, energy doesn't dissipate. It pools. It looks for something with a shape to hold it. Despite his skepticism, John's hands shook as he took a sip of lukewarm coffee. It's just wood and wire, Elias. It shouldn't be able to change its own posture. It isn't using muscles, John. It's folding reality around itself, Elias replied, gathering his maps. I'll come tonight. Don't touch it. Don't talk to it, and whatever you do, don't let it see you looking at the door. By the time John returned to the cottage, the sun was a dying ember, sinking into the purple bruise of the moor. The house felt different, tighter, as if the walls had drawn a deep breath and held it. He entered the study with his eyes downcast, but the urge to look was a physical itch. When he finally glanced at the mantel, his breath hitched. The doll was gone. The shelf was empty, save for a thin layer of dust and a single emerald green thread. Panic, sharp and primal, surged through him. He checked the floor, thinking it had fallen, but the rug was clear. He backed out of the room, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Scritch, scritch. The sound came from the hallway behind him. John spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The doll was sitting on the third step of the staircase. It was no longer slumped. It sat perfectly upright, its porcelain hands gripping the banister. Its head snapped up, the midnight blue eyes reflecting the flashlight beam with an impossible liquid shimmer. It had moved 20 feet in the seconds it took him to blink. A heavy knock sounded on the front door. John lunged for it, nearly tripping over his own feet, and threw it open to find Elias standing there, clutching a heavy leather satchel and a sprig of dried rowan. "It's moved," John gasped, pointing toward the stairs. "It's off the shelf." Elias stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shadows. He looked at the staircase, then back at John, his expression turning deathly pale. "John, I didn't see a doll on the stairs." John looked back. The step was empty, but as he turned his head, he felt a tiny cold weight settle onto his shoulder, and a faint porcelain dry whisper brushed against his ear. "Write me a better ending, John." John froze. The weight on his shoulder was no more than a few ounces, yet it felt like a leaden anchor dragging him toward the floorboards. The smell was the worst part, not just dust, but the cloying sweet scent of something rotten, hidden behind an expensive lavender water. "Elias," John choked out, his eyes wide and unblinking. "It's on me. I can feel the porcelain." Elias stood in the center of his salt and powder circle, his face a mask of frantic concentration. He gripped his leather satchel so hard his knuckles turned white. "Don't move, John. If you acknowledge it, you give it the permission it needs to finalize the bond. It's a parasite of perception." But John couldn't help it. He felt a tiny, rigid hand, cold as ice, slide under the collar of his shirt. The fingers weren't soft. They were hard, unyielding points that scraped against his skin. Then came the voice. It wasn't a sound in the air, but a vibration felt directly against his collarbone. "Such a beautiful house," the doll whispered, the voice sounding like the rubbing of dry parchment. "But it needs a body to keep the heart warm." "Get off me!" John shrieked, breathing and breaking the circle and lunging toward Elias. As he moved, the doll didn't fall. It clung to him with an impossible strength. John felt a sharp, stinging prick at the base of his neck, a needle-thin intrusion. Suddenly his legs refused to follow his commands. He stumbled, his movements becoming jerky, mechanical. Elias backed away, his horror overriding his desire to help. "John, your hands!" John looked down. His skin was turning a translucent matte white. His fingernails were fading, merging into smooth, rounded tips of buffed, bone-like porcelain. The joints of his fingers were thickening, forming a distinct ball and socket grooves. "Elias, help me!" John tried to scream, but his jaw locked. His lips felt heavy, coated in something thick and red. Not blood, but a permanent high-gloss paint. The doll on his shoulder began to grow, or perhaps John was shrinking. The perspective of the room shifted violently. The ceiling soared upward, the shadows of the rafters becoming vast caverns, like a voidful cavern. The floorboards beneath him looked like great plains of weathered timber. Elias was now a giant, a flickering titan of shadow and fear. "I'm sorry," the giant whispered, his voice a booming thunder that hurt John's little ceramic ears. "It's too late. The Moor has its right now." Elias turned and fled to the front door, slamming with a crash that vibrated through John's entire fragile frame. John tried to turn his head, but it moved only in rhythmic clicking increments. He was sitting on the floor now, his emerald silk suit, once doll-size, now fitting his shrunken body perfectly. Across from him, standing at his full height, was a man who looked exactly like John. The new John adjusted his glasses and looked down at the porcelain figure on the floor. The entity flexed its new fleshy fingers, testing the warmth of the blood in its veins. The ending needed work, the entity said, its voice, John's voice, smooth and vibrant. The man picked up the doll by its waist. John felt the terrifying pressure of those massive warm hands. He was lifted high into the air and placed on the cold stone mantelpiece. The man turned John to face the room, ensuring he had a perfect view of the desk. "Watch closely," the entity whispered, seating itself at the typewriter. "I'm going to write us a masterpiece." The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the keys began echoing through the lonely house. John could only stare out of his fixed glass eyes, a prisoner in a body of clay, watching a stranger live his life, while the fog of the moor pressed against the glass, waiting for its turn to come inside.